Okay, so you think you got everyday American English down pat. Well, let's see. We're taking this guide, Everyday Conversations, Learning American English, and we're going to deep dive into it and see what we can find. It's meant for people learning English, but I bet even native speakers like ourselves will find some surprising things in there.
Yeah, it's interesting how much we reveal without even realizing it, just in our casual day-to-day chit-chat. Like, it's almost a cultural fingerprint.
Hidden in plain sight, right? And this guy dives right into it, starting with greetings. I mean, I was struck by just how much emphasis they place on the difference between a formal versus informal greeting.
Uh-huh.
Like, think about it. Good morning, Professor Austin, versus, hey, Helen, how's it going?
Yeah, and it's not just not being polite or not, You're signaling the whole relationship you have with that person. And it's amazing we adjust our language like that without even thinking about it.
It's true. It really is. It's almost like an instinct, but it speaks volumes about, the social dynamics and the context of the situation. Like even, the guy points out how long you shake someone's hand can send a message.
Really?
Yeah, apparently 2 to 3 seconds is the sweet spot. Anything more than that, you're venturing into awkward territory.
I can see that. Yeah, I can see that.
It really is. All that meaning packed into these little nonverbal cues, and even a simple response to thank you. Think about it.
Uh-huh.
The guide lists don't mention it or no problem, in addition to just a plain you're welcome.
Right.
Have you ever noticed how much we use these variations in casual conversation?
Now that you mention it, yeah. Yeah, I do.
Yeah, and I've never thought about it. Is there actually a deeper meaning behind them, or is it just like personal preference?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. On the surface, they all kind of mean the same thing, right? But I do think they have these subtle differences in tone.
Uh-huh.
Like, you're welcome is definitely more formal, whereas no problem kind of suggests the favor was effortless.
Oh, okay.
And don't mention it kind of downplays the act of kindness, making it seem small or insignificant.
Yeah, so even in these tiny little exchanges, we're making choices that reflect our backgrounds and personalities without even thinking about it.
Exactly. And when we get into the section on intonation, it becomes even clearer how much is communicated beyond just the words themselves.
Oh, yeah.
Think of intonation as like the melody of language. It's how our voices rise and fall, convey emotion, and add emphasis and signal our intentions.
The guide actually gives this example of find, thanks, and you. The way you say and you can change the entire meaning. A rising intonation shows genuine interest. But if you say it flat, it can sound perfunctory.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And again, it's something we do without even thinking about it.
It's true.
The guide also points out that falling intonation is really common in information questions. Like, where are you off to? It's like a vocal cue guiding the flow of the conversation. Fascinating, really.
It is, and then you add emphasis on top of all of that. And that's a whole other layer of complexity. The guide talks about how we emphasize certain words in a sentence to highlight what's important. Like, he just finished writing has a completely different meaning than I'm really excited.
Right.
And it all just depends on where the emphasis falls.
Yeah, and the emphasis can shift the focus of a sentence, It can even reveal the speaker's attitude. Sometimes you can inject humor or sarcasm.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's like a secret code in our everyday speech. Makes you realize how much we must miss when we're not paying attention. But speaking of codes, we can't forget about idioms.
Right, right.
These quirky expressions that add so much color to language.
Oh, this is where language really comes alive, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Idioms like long time no see or what a small world. Those can be really confusing for non-native speakers, but for those in the know, it adds a layer of richness and shared understanding.
It's true. They're like cultural shortcuts, right? Conveying a complex idea in just a few words. And some of them, they're surprisingly literal when you think about it, like tie the knot for getting married.
Or shoot some hoops for playing basketball. And all of these give you a glimpse into the history and values of a culture.
And so much we can learn from a culture just by how people speak. And, this guide doesn't shy away from cultural insights either. It touches on everything from tipping etiquette at restaurants to how to address people formally or informally, which I think can be a minefield even for, someone that's lived in the U.S. their whole life.
Oh, absolutely. It is a minefield. And it highlights that language learning, it's not just about grammar and vocab. It's about these unspoken rules of social interaction.
It's true. It's true. And, these subtle cues can make or break a conversation. The guide then dives into those tricky phrasal verbs, the ones that trip up English language learners all the time.
Oh, yes, those verbs that just love to play dress up with prepositions.
Exactly. It's like they completely change the meaning depending on what preposition you put with them. Like pick up can mean get when you're buying something or trying on for testing the fit of clothes. It's like the preposition just changes the whole game.
It really does. It's enough to make anyone's head spin, but that's also what makes English so dynamic and expressive.
It really is. Okay, so we've covered greetings, intonation, emphasis, idioms, cultural insights, and even those pesky phrasal verbs. But before we move on, I kind of want to see how this guide tackles grammar without getting too technical.
You know what? It's actually quite subtle in its approach. It weaves in grammatical points organically, showing how they function in actual real-life conversations.
Like the use of negative questions. Those could be so confusing for English language learners.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Didn't you meet her? Sounds simple enough, but there's a lot of implied meaning packed in there.
Uh-huh. And then you have the structure get have plus object plus participle to describe services, like get my hair cut.
Oh, okay, yeah.
That's a really common construction, but you might not learn that in a traditional textbook.
It's interesting to see how these simple grammatical structures say so much about how we think and communicate. But speaking of communication, the guide also doesn't neglect pronunciation.
Of course not. Of course not. And it goes beyond just individual sounds.
Right.
It dives into contractions, stress patterns in compound nouns, and even colloquial pronunciations, which are so common we hardly notice them.
Like Ghana and Wana, right? They're everywhere.
Everywhere. Little linguistic shortcuts making our speech more natural and fluid.
And it just highlights how different spoken English can be from the written form.
Oh, for sure. It's more relaxed, more nuanced, full of little variations reflecting the speaker's personality and social context. Yeah, it really is. It really is amazing how much pronunciation can vary. But let's shift gears for a sec and actually get into the dialogues this guide presents. What really stood out to you as insightful?
You know what? One thing I thought was really interesting is how they blended the language learning with cultural understanding. Like, it's not just about memorizing a bunch of phrases. It's about actually understanding the context of when you would use those phrases.
Exactly. Like the dialogue about ordering a meal at a restaurant seems like an everyday thing, but there's so much about American dining culture packed in there.
Oh, yeah. Like the casual back and forth between the waiter and the customer.
Mm-hmm.
The way the waiter suggests, "Can I start you off with something to drink?"
Right.
And the customer responds, "Yes, I'll have." And I'll have. It's like this little dance that we do without even realizing it.
It is. It is. And then there are these subtle things that you might miss if you weren't familiar with American customs. Like the guide actually points out that it's customary to tip the waiter.
Oh, right.
And it gives guidelines on how much to tip based on the quality of service.
See, those are the little details that can make such a big difference. It's not even just about politeness. It's showing that you get it, you know? You understand and respect the culture.
Absolutely. And these cultural insights, they're kind of woven throughout the whole guide. Another great example is the dialogue about asking for directions.
Okay.
It highlights that subtle difference between could you tell me, which is more polite, and can you tell me, which is more direct.
It's funny how those little grammatical choices can make a difference in how you come across.
Absolutely. And the guide doesn't just focus on like verbal communication.
Right.
It points out the nonverbal cues too. For instance, in that asking for directions dialogue, it mentions the speaker might actually point in the direction while saying it's that way.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah.
So you get that extra layer of clarification.
It's like a whole other language layered on top of the spoken words.
It really is. And it makes you realize how much we depend on those nonverbal cues.
We do. We do. And, you know, those cues, they change from culture to culture.
Oh, absolutely.
So something that's polite here might be totally rude somewhere else.
Exactly. So it's super important to be aware of those cultural differences, especially when you're traveling or, interacting with people from different backgrounds.
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure. But, even within a single culture, you have all these different levels of formality and informality.
Right.
And this guy does such a good job of illustrating that through the dialogues.
Yeah, yeah.
Like the one that really stood out to me was the one about calling 911. That's a high-stakes situation where you really need to be clear and concise with your language.
Oh, absolutely.
And the guide points out how the speaker is actually stressing key words like car accident, post office, Charles Street, to make sure that those emergency services get the information right.
Right. Right. It's a reminder that even in like those really stressful moments, the way we use language can have a huge impact.
It really can. It really can. It just underscores the importance of being able to adapt our language to different contexts.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we got to be formal and precise, and other times, more casual is fine.
Yeah.
Speaking of casual, one dialogue I found really relatable was the one about going to the supermarket.
Uh-huh.
I'm a terrible grocery shopper, so I was curious to see if the guide had any tips for me.
Well, I mean, the dialogue certainly offers some useful phrases. Like it points out how the phrase the recipe calls for is like a natural way to say the recipe says we need.
Oh, okay.
It also highlights the use of lists and how each item on the list is stressed for clarity.
Right. And I love the part where they talked about that silent S in aisles, which always trips me up when I try to pronounce it.
Uh-huh.
It's those little pronunciation quirks that can really catch you off guard.
They really can. But back to your grocery shopping struggles.
Oh, yeah.
The dialogue also explains how to ask someone to do something for you, like, why don't you get the dairy ingredients?
Okay.
Which is a polite way to, like, divide and conquer that grocery list.
Teamwork makes the dream work.
That's right. That's right. And speaking of teamwork, the dialogue about catching up after class, it emphasizes the use of casual expressions like, how did your physics exam go? And how about you?
Yeah.
Those are so commonplace, but it's helpful to actually see them used in a natural conversation.
Right. And they show how important those follow-up questions are
Uh-huh.
to really show that you're interested in what the other person is saying.
Like, how'd your presentation go?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Just a simple question, but it can really build rapport.
It really can, and those casual conversations can often lead to plans for future activities, like, studying together or playing basketball.
Oh, yeah.
Speaking of activities, I was really interested in the dialogue about hobbies.
Okay.
It mentioned that Ghana is a colloquial form of I'm going to.
Right. That's one of those contractions that we use all the time when we're speaking, but you would never write it formally.
Right, exactly. And the dialogue also highlights the use of descriptive language when you're talking about those hobbies. Like, the leaves are already turning all shades of red and orange. It will be awesome.
Yeah.
It really paints a picture and shows the speaker's excitement.
It's contagious. I want to go for a hike now.
Me too. Me too. But before we get our hiking boots on, let's talk about the dialogue on weddings.
Oh, yeah.
Weddings, so culturally rich, full of traditions and symbolism.
It is. It is. And this dialogue is full of interesting details, like the expression, tie the knot. That's an informal way to say get married.
Exactly. And it also highlights that cultural norm of expressing excitement and admiration. Like, doesn't the bride look beautiful?
Right.
With the expectation of a yes.
Yeah. Yeah. It's those little social cues that can be so confusing if you're not from that culture.
Absolutely. But the guide, it does a great job of explaining those things in a way that's clear and easy to understand.
It does. It does. And finally, we come to the dialogue about giving advice. This one's full of helpful phrases like, I think it's time for a change, and trust me.
Uh-huh.
Conveying confidence and authority.
Absolutely.
And I love how direct the advice is. Take the job. What do you have to lose? Sometimes we just need that really push to take a chance,
Yeah. Yeah, and that's often where those rewarding experiences are waiting for us.
It's true. It's true. Outside of our comfort zones, right? Ready to embrace the unknown.
Exactly. This deep dive, it's been quite the journey, wouldn't you say, through these everyday English conversations. And I feel like I've learned so much about the language, the culture behind it.
Me too. Me too. And to think all of this is hidden in these conversations that we have every day. Yeah, it really is. Like we don't even think about all the richness packed into these everyday conversations. We just take them for granted.
I know. And it makes you realize, it's so much more than just the words themselves.
True.
It's like we're sending and receiving all these signals constantly, navigating this crazy web of social cues and cultural norms. And what's interesting is that this whole web, it's always changing.
That's a good point. That's what struck me too. Like this guide, it's a glimpse of American English today, but who knows how different these conversations will sound like 10 years from now, 20 years from now.
Right. Language, it's alive. It's always adapting.
Always evolving. And, think of that. How much technology has already changed how we communicate? I mean, you got emoji, you got slang that was born on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
Entirely new ways of expressing ourselves.
Right. It makes you think about how these changes will shape language in the future.
It does. It does. Will we be better communicators, or will we lose some of the nuance and depth that comes with traditional ways of speaking?
That's a really good question and something to really think about. But I think what we can take away from this deep dive is that it's so important to be observant. Whether you're learning a new language or just trying to better understand the one you already speak, pay attention to how people talk. The expressions they use, those nonverbal cues they're giving you.
It's like being a language detective.
Exactly. You're uncovering those hidden meanings behind all those everyday chats. And you know what? That's a skill that'll help you in everything, not just language learning.
It's true.
It can make you a better communicator, a more empathetic listener, and a more insightful person overall.
Well said. Well said. So how can our listeners apply all this to their own lives? How can they improve their own English fluency, their understanding of American culture? What would you suggest?
Well, I would say keep exploring these everyday conversations,
Mm-hmm.
listen to podcasts, watch movies and TV shows,
Okay.
and most importantly, talk to native speakers.
Yeah, get out there and practice.
Exactly. And don't be scared to make mistakes. That's how you learn.
It's true. Every mistake is a chance to learn something new.
Exactly. Embrace the challenge and enjoy the process.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive into everyday American English conversations. We've uncovered all sorts of hidden meanings, explored cultural nuances, and hopefully inspired you to take a closer look at the language we use every single day.
And who knows, maybe one day you'll be the expert guiding someone else through the world of language and culture.
Keep those ears open, right? The world is full of amazing conversations just waiting to be decoded. Until next time, happy conversing.